If there's no Jeffrey Epstein client list, does his associate Ghislaine Maxwell walk free? Big question has been, well, who exactly did she sex traffic minors to? And after the announcement from the DOJ and FBI, is that a valid legal point? Let's talk about how the recent announcement from the government on Epstein's perceived lack of accomplices may affect the only person who's actually been convicted.
Something just detonated in the public conversation again, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It never does. It builds quietly in the background, piece by piece, until one moment flips the switch and suddenly everything is front and center again.
To Ghislaine Maxwell, okay, and I'm going to explain why, because as we discussed on a previous sidebar, there was this DOJ FBI memo that was released a few days ago, and it describes how the Department of Justice and the FBI conducted, quote, an exhaustive review of investigative holdings relating to Jeffrey Epstein. How, quote, the FBI conducted digital searches of its databases, hard drives, and network drives, as well as physical searches of squad areas, locked cabinets, desks, closets, and other areas where responsive material may have been stored. These searches uncovered a significant amount of material, including more than 300 gigabytes of data and physical evidence. The files relating to Epstein include a large volume of images of Epstein, images and videos of victims who are either minors or appear to be minors, and over 10,000 downloaded videos and images of illegal child sex abuse material and other pornography. And through that review of digital and documentary evidence, the DOJ, the FBI concluded the following, quote, this systematic review revealed no incriminating client list. There was also no credible evidence found that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. We did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties. That is the section we want to focus on today, because obviously this is big news and surprising news. Surprising news, maybe not even necessarily from an investigative standpoint or what we've learned over the years from different lawsuits, but the perceived stance from the Trump administration and also some of the commentary from high-profile people when it came to the Epstein files. There seemed to be this idea that all of the information and new information would be exposed. Whether that's a fair interpretation or not, that's the conversation, because in February, President Trump's attorney, Alina Habba, told Piers Morgan there would, quote, be names that will come out. And America needs to remember one thing: we are going to be promises made, promises kept. There was even talk from Attorney General Pam Bondi that complicated the issue, because back in February, she said on Fox News, when asked if she would release, quote, list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients, she responded, it's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. In March, she said to Fox News host Mark Levin, when he argued that perhaps Democratic officials in New York were not providing all of the Epstein information because they, quote, don't like the names on the list, and that they were, quote, trying to protect a lot of names and individuals, Bondi replied that she had, quote, not reviewed the information yet, but added, I think it's very interesting that they withheld that from us. Now, not trying to get too political here, I'm going to get to the legal point I want to get to when it comes with Ghislaine Maxwell, but White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt seemed to do some damage control, saying the other day that what Bondi was referring to about having the client list on her desk was, quote, she was saying the entirety of all of the paperwork, all of the paper in relation to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. That's what the Attorney General was referring to. Either way, and aside from the blowback and the criticism and the theories, the main question is that we want to talk about right now: does this affect Jeffrey Epstein's former associate, Ghislaine Maxwell? Remember, she was convicted in December of 2021 in New York federal court of conspiracy to entice minors to travel, to engage in illegal sex acts.
That's where we are right now. A surge of attention, a wave of reaction, and a level of intensity that feels different from the last time this story made noise. Because this time, it's not just recycled outrage. It's not just people repeating what they've already heard. It's new energy, driven by details that feel heavier, darker, and harder to ignore. The kind of details that don't sit comfortably. The kind that force people to stop pretending they don't see the bigger picture. And that's why the reaction is explosive. It's not just shock. It's not just curiosity. It's a mix of anger, disbelief, and something else, something closer to realization. Because when information tied to old, controversial files starts resurfacing with new attention, it changes how people process everything that came before. Suddenly, the past doesn't feel settled anymore. It feels unfinished. It feels like there were layers that never got fully explored, angles that were never fully examined, and details that were either overlooked or kept out of
The part where I hear you, there might be no consolidated list that he kept in his bedside drawer, but the idea, basically what they're saying is there's no other people to charge at this time or to investigate. And what's interesting is this is the commentary we've been getting. You get comments from Elon Musk posting on X, what's the time? Oh look, it's no one has been arrested o'clock again. And remember, he famously accused Trump not too long ago of being on the Epstein list. There was conservative activist Laura Loomer, who wrote on X, if she doesn't get fired over this Epstein memo, people are going to be so black-pilled. You have influencer Liz Wheeler, who said on the Glenn Beck show, contextualizing all of this seems like unforgivable behavior. So the question becomes, aren't they trying to close the door on investigating anybody else connected with Jeffrey Epstein? Aren't they saying there is no one else?
I think that is what they're saying. Now, so Elon Musk is wrong when he says no one was arrested, right? Because Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. So it's not nobody was arrested. There may be other people here, but, think about this historically. We don't tend to go after the Johns. We don't tend to go after the people who pay the prostitutes or get the services of sex workers. We tend to go after the workers and the people who facilitate that and the sex traffickers. So the government could be saying, we know there were other people involved, but we're not going to prosecute them because that's not the way we expend our resources. That's not quite the way they're saying it. They're really trying to say more, we don't have enough evidence to charge anybody else. I'm a little skeptical about that, to tell you the truth.
Well, now I have to get to the main aspect of this, because this has come up a lot now. So the question now is, does this affect Ghislaine Maxwell? Because how many times have people already made the argument, well, wait a second, she was convicted of sex trafficking, but sex trafficking these victims to who? In other words, if the government is coming out and saying now that there are no other clients, then does it make sense that she was convicted of essentially operating this extensive sex trafficking operation? Let me add a little bit more context to this. You have a political activist named Jack Posevich, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, wrote on X, if there were no clients, why is Ghislaine Maxwell still in jail? You had podcasters, the Hodge twins, who wrote, Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison for 20 years for sex trafficking kids with Epstein, and the DOJ and FBI just said that there's no client list. He didn't blackmail nobody, and nobody else is getting charged, so they sex traffic kids to nobody? And then you tell me, are those fair criticisms, or is this a misunderstanding of what the criminal trial against Ghislaine Maxwell was about?
I think it's a misunderstanding of what the trial was about, and it's a misunderstanding about how the criminal justice process works. So let me break that down a little bit. She was convicted of sex trafficking based on evidence presented in a month-long trial in court. And apparently that evidence didn't include a client list, because we've never seen a client list. We're now told there is no client list. So it wasn't amongst the evidence that was used against her. She could have sex trafficked only to herself and to Jeffrey Epstein. If the evidence was that she brought underage girls to have sexual relations with Epstein and or with her, that would be enough. You don't need any clients. You don't need anybody else. That
focus long enough for people to move on. But now moving on isn't an option. Because what's coming back into the spotlight isn't easy to brush aside. It's not vague. It's not abstract. It carries a tone that suggests intention, structure, and something far more calculated than people originally believed. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because if even a portion of what's being discussed holds weight, it means the original understanding of this entire situation was incomplete. Not slightly incomplete, significantly incomplete. And that realization hits hard. It forces people to reevaluate everything, every headline they read back then, every statement they accepted, Every conclusion they thought was final, it all comes back under scrutiny. That's what fuels a reaction like this. Not just the content itself, but what it implies about everything surrounding it. Because once people start feeling like they were only given part of the story,
Is still sex trafficking, and she could have been convicted for that fairly and squarely. So I don't think any client list was necessary to her prosecution, but it wasn't part of her prosecution. And so here's the procedure point I want to bring up. If you are convicted of a crime, you can appeal based on mistakes that happened in the trial, errors of law, the judge did something wrong, the jury did something wrong. You can appeal on that basis. Occasionally, you can seek to overturn a conviction based on newly found evidence. If there's evidence that comes out that all of a sudden demonstrates you're not guilty or points the finger at somebody else, there are mechanisms to go back to court and say, I was wrongly convicted. But that's not this case. You can't go back to court to overturn a conviction because you find out there's evidence that doesn't exist, right? What's the argument?
I guess the argument, if the elements were that she sex trafficked to multiple people, including Epstein, then I think they would have an argument, right? But if the element of a charge was it has to be she sex trafficked these individuals to multiple people, then I think they have an argument. But look, let me read you the specific language. So this is some of the specific language that was used by the prosecution. And when I say specific, I mean, this was very, very deliberate how they said it. So the victims were as young as 14 years old when they were groomed and abused by Maxwell and Epstein. Okay, no one else, both of whom knew that their victims were in fact minors. As a part and in furtherance of their scheme to abuse minor victims, Maxwell and Epstein enticed and caused minor victims to travel to Epstein's residences in different states, which Maxwell knew and intended would result in their grooming for and subjection to sexual abuse. As Maxwell and Epstein intended, these grooming behaviors left minor victims vulnerable and susceptible to sexual abuse by Epstein, period. That was it, only person. Maxwell was then present for certain sexual encounters between minor victims and Epstein, such as interactions where a minor victim was undressed and ultimately was present for sex acts perpetrated by Epstein on minor victims. That's deliberate language right there. They weren't trying to make this a bigger case than it was.
That's right. That's exactly what I said. This is about trafficking to Epstein and Maxwell, not to anybody else. There's no allegation in what you just read about other clients, and therefore there's no allegation about a client list, and therefore the existence or non-existence of a client list is completely irrelevant to her prosecution and her conviction. The claim in her case was that she trafficked minors who were abused by herself and by Epstein. Evidence was presented to that jury, which they credited and convicted her of. I don't see any way that's getting overturned just based on this latest announcement.
You know, there people might look at it and say, wait a minute. There's no way she could have done it herself. In fact, during her trial, I believe Juan Alessi, who was a house manager, had testified that she directed him, Epstein and her directed him to contact and pick up girls for these massages. So somebody will look at the news and say, again, I don't.
They don't just question that story, they question the system that delivered it. And that's when things escalate. Because now it's not just about one situation, it's about patterns. It's about how information is handled, how narratives are shaped, and how certain details manage to stay buried until moments like this. Moments where everything resurfaces at once. And when that happens, it creates pressure. Pressure on everyone connected to the story, directly or indirectly, pressure on institutions, on media, on anyone who had a role in shaping the original narrative. Because now people want answers. Not vague responses, not carefully worded statements, real answers. And the longer those answers don't come, the louder the reaction gets. That's the cycle playing out right now. Information surfaces. Reaction explodes. Silence or deflection follows. And that silence only amplifies everything. Because in a situation like this, silence doesn't feel neutral, It feels
law being passed. But the law itself says if there's ongoing criminal investigations, DOJ does not have to turn those over. Now, that means it's up to Pam Bondi. So your level of faith that this is going to be a full and transparent disclosure is equal to your level of faith in Pam Bondi. Because I know from being inside DOJ, you can open an investigation on anything you want. You can claim that almost anything relates to an investigation somehow. That's number one. Number two, even broader, there's an exception for any materials in the Epstein files that might impact national security. DOJ can withhold those. Now, you're probably thinking, what could this have to do with, United States dealing with Venezuela or Israel or whatever? How about this, though? Couldn't an attorney general say, well, that's material in there that's embarrassing or might reflect poorly on the president, the commander in chief, the chief diplomat of the nation. And if it's something that makes him look bad or could be used to embarrass him or could be used to extort him, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but, could be made to look like he's in a bad position, that could undermine our national security. Hence, I will withhold that. So those are the two massive loopholes. And the last thing, Jesse, is we're not going to know. It's not as if Pam Bondi has to do what lawyers do sometimes. We do like a privilege log saying, okay, other side, here's a description of some documents that I've withheld because they're privileged. We're not going to have that. We're not going to know what we don't know. We're not going to know what Pam Bondi has chosen to withhold. So again, we are sort of at the mercy and whim of Pam Bondi here.
So in other words, we won't know if everything is really turned over unless there's some evidence to suggest something was withheld. And I want to get into that because...
she may be asked. Look, someone may ask, did you withhold anything? And she may say, yes, consistent with the law as passed, I've withheld national security and investigative files. But we're not going to see them, and we're not going to know how many and which ones. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to get into that a little bit further. There's another aspect of it, too, because it says under this law, they can withhold or redact the identities and personal and medical files of Epstein's victims. They can also withhold material that would constitute a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy or depicts or contains child sexual abuse, which they should. But yeah. I guess one of the big questions I've been asked is, so whatever they release, whatever it is they're going to release, is it going to be pages of blacked out redactions?
I would expect that. I think there's going to be two categories of things we don't see. There's going to be entire files, entire documents that we don't know exist that we're not going to see. But yes, get ready to see. Also, it could be, let's give an example. Let's say you have an FBI 302, which, Jesse, as you know, is a formal typed up summary of a witness interview that prosecutors have done. It could be there's a 33-page 302 where half of it is blacked out, where names are blacked out, where individual paragraphs are blacked out. That's going to take a while for DOJ to figure out, although we'll talk about timing in a moment. But yeah, I would expect to see quite a bit of redaction ink in what we do see.
And just to send it back, so we believe, right, when we talk about what this could be, this is all connected to the Florida and New York investigations into Jeffrey Epstein, right? Generally speaking, I guess that's what it is, and we'll get a little more granular, but generally,
well, that's what I think. That's a great question, because it's not necessarily everything that's known to the world about Jeffrey Epstein. It's not even, we've already seen that Epstein's estate seems to have some documents that DOJ does not have. There was two major investigations of Epstein. There was the one down in the Southern District of Florida, which was federal, run by Alexander Acosta back in 06, 07, 08, which resulted in his sweetheart deal where he did 13 months in state and he was in and out, of custody. That was the original sin in this case. That was when Alexander Acosta let him off very, very easily. Acosta to this day has never provided a satisfactory explanation of why. But so that'll be one set of documents.
Intentional. It feels like something is being avoided. And that perception is enough to keep the momentum going. You can see it everywhere. Discussions aren't slowing down, they're accelerating. People are going deeper, pulling threads, connecting points that weren't connected before. And some of those connections are raising serious questions. Questions about who knew what and when. Questions about how certain details were handled. Questions about why some aspects of the story were emphasized while others barely got attention. And those questions don't have simple answers. Which is exactly why they keep spreading. Because uncertainty fuels engagement. It keeps people invested, keeps them searching, keeps them talking, and the more they talk, the bigger the story becomes. That's where things start to spiral. Because once a narrative reaches this level of attention, it's no longer controlled by any single source. It becomes decentralized. Everyone contributes, everyone interprets, Everyone
prosecutors, not New York prosecutors, so they say her prosecution was legitimate, and the Supreme Court, as I mentioned, declined to hear her appeal. The CVRA, which I mentioned, is the Crime Victims' Rights Act, so it just establishes a Bill of Federal Rights for a victim. But anyway, it goes on to say, quote, Edwards, who is Bradley Edwards, represented a lot of Jeffrey Epstein accusers. Edwards used as the proxy for AUSA Villafana, both conspiring to overturn the MPA through the CVR litigation, obtaining police records and victims' names from law enforcement, and USAO Florida AUSA Villafana sharing information with potential claimants, using the information for secret settlements with men with deep pockets in exchange for keeping the identity of those men out of the public arena to benefit the personal pocketbooks of plaintiffs' lawyers. And she says it's listed out. Quote, in 2016, the plaintiff's lawyers met to instigate an investigation into the petitioner. The plaintiff's lawyers representing the complainants had approached the SDNY in 2016 in an effort to promote and instigate a criminal prosecution because the SDFL was not happy with the NPA, and the plaintiff's lawyers wanted to assist the CVR case for financial motives. There were 4 employee co-conspirators that were not indicted, but named in NPA and referenced in the Jeffrey Epstein indictment. New evidence reveals that there were 25 men with which the plaintiff's lawyers reached secret settlements that could equally be considered as co-conspirators. None of these men have been prosecuted, and none has been revealed to petitioner. She would have called them as witnesses had she known. Okay, Gene, a lot there. But basically the argument is, there were these secret settlements. There's other people that could have been indicted. She's the only one that was indicted. And she didn't even know about these alleged secret settlements in the civil context, right? Because there was a lot of litigation regarding Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Your thoughts?
There's a famous case called Kyle v. Whitley. It was decided April 19th, 1995, the same day, ironically, as the Oklahoma City bombing. I remember that case very well. And what the Supreme Court said, it talked about the difference between Brady information and what they call Giglio information, Giglio. Brady information is information that raises a reasonable probability, not beyond a reasonable doubt, not even beyond preponderance, a reasonable probability that had that information been provided to the defendant, the outcome of the proceeding, the sentencing, the verdict would have been different. What I hear from you and what I hear from the reporting is of those 25 or so settlements, there's a reasonable probability that had it been disclosed to Maxwell's trial team, they could have investigated and gotten information as to why they were not charged, what benefits they got, and more important, whether it would help her argument of selective prosecution. And I would add this. It also could possibly help an argument for vindictive prosecution, where the prosecutors want to focus just on her. Vindictive and selective are kind of like cousins, right, and they both are bad. They are hard to prove, but this is evidence that could cause a reasonable probability that it could help her and cause a change in the verdict or the decision of the court to sentence her to 20 years. So all I can say is this. This is a hot mess, and if there's a hearing on her petition, and there likely will be, you can guarantee that prosecutors may be called, either in the Southern District or in the Florida U.S. Attorney's.
Adds their own perspective, and that creates a flood of information. Some of it grounded, some of it speculative, but all of it feeding into the same growing sense that there's more beneath the surface. That's the common thread. No matter what angle people are coming from, they all seem to agree on one thing: this isn't the full picture. And that belief is what's driving the explosive reaction. Because people don't like feeling like they're missing pieces, especially when those pieces could change how they understand something this serious. So they dig. They revisit old material, analyze it with fresh eyes, and suddenly things that once seemed insignificant start to stand out. Small details, offhand comments, moments that didn't raise alarms before but now feel different in hindsight. And those moments add up. They create a pattern. And once a pattern forms, it's hard to ignore. That's when the narrative starts to shift. From isolated incidents to something more connected. And that shift is already happening. You can see it in the tone, in the intensity, in the way people are refusing to let this be dismissed as just another headline. They're paying attention. They're connecting dots. And they're not backing off. So now the focus turns to what comes next. Will there be more revelations? Will there be clear responses? Will the full scope of this situation ever be laid out in a way that feels complete? Or will this remain fragmented, with pieces surfacing over time but never forming a fully acknowledged picture? That's the uncertainty hanging over everything right now. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the reaction alive. Because until there's resolution, there's momentum. And right now, that momentum is still building. Not fading. Not slowing. Building. And as long as it continues, this story isn't going anywhere. It's going to stay in the spotlight, keep generating reaction, keep forcing attention. Because once something reaches this level of exposure, it doesn't just disappear. It embeds itself in the public consciousness. And from there, it keeps evolving. One detail at a time. One reaction at a time. Until something finally brings it to a point where it can't be ignored anymore. And right now, it's getting closer to that point.